Welcome back to the show. I'm so honored you decided to spend a few minutes with us here today. And we have an awesome guest today, tremendous amount of experience. I think it's really something we can all learn from. So I hope you stick with us through the entire episode. On today's show, we have Chief Thomas Weitzel. He retired in 2021 for 37 years of service. He's a nationally certified ethics instructor. He holds a master's degree in criminal justice from Lewis University and is a graduate of numerous leadership schools, including Session 218 of the FBI National Academy. His resume is long. He's a volunteer ambassador for the National Law Enforcement Memorial Fund. Much more he's been involved in. We're certainly interested in learning from him today. Tom, how are you doing, sir?
I'm doing fantastic. Thank you for having me.
Well, it's always seemed strange to me that people like us, I believe you were chief for over 13 years, and obviously you have 37 years of service, that people just kind of retire and that's kind of it. And I really have often thought that there's so much we can learn from individuals such as yourself and others that have invested so much and given so much to this profession. But you've stayed pretty active after retirement. So I guess the first question is, walk us through your career. Now, I want to get to a seminal event about 3 years into your career, so maybe jump over that for now, but kind of walk us through your career, and then we'll kind of get to what you're doing now.
Yeah, so I started my career actually in Illinois. They have a private public police agency. It was actually through the Chicago Zoological Society at Brookfield Zoo. They were fully certified police officers, but it was more of a private than it was public. Your jurisdiction was just on their grounds. I started there probably 22, and then I started testing locally, and I ended up in Riverside, which was adjacent to Brookfield. And I worked 37 years, and I've held every position there. I started as a patrol officer, was after 15 years promoted to patrol sergeant. I did 6 years as the detective sergeant. I went to an operations lieutenant, to the deputy chief, and then I even did a stint as acting chief until the elected officials in Riverside decided what way they wanted to go, because there was, they were going to do a national search. And it's kind of funny. They came to me and said, "Hey, Tom, we're going to spend these big dollars to do a national search to find a new chief. Would you be willing to put in for it?" And I said, "Nope. I've worked here for 25 years. You know me." I said, I don't think that's the way to go. And about 3 days later, the politicians and then our city manager came to see me and said, "Okay, what does it take for us to put you in that position?" So then we negotiated an employment contract for me. But initially I had a very difficult time that they were going to spend all this money and do this national search. Riverside is a suburban community of Chicago, and they had known me inside and out, and I'm glad that they decided not to do that.
Yeah, and it's so often that cities do that, right? It's almost to look like they're doing some national search, even though they want somebody that they take. So it's not that the right decision was made. But you lasted there, I believe, 13 years as chief. That is not an easy thing to do. What was the secret? Because most chiefs are, they don't last that long in that position. Very stressful position, very tough position. Kind of what was the secret to your success with that lasting that long?
Yeah, so you're right. It was a long time, especially in Illinois. I mean, I think the tenure of most chiefs was like 4 to 5 years. But I had a really good, the citizens in Riverside, Illinois are very supportive of the police. The elected officials were very supportive in almost all cases, and our village manager was as well. When I was first hired, the very first village president I worked under, he came to my office and he said, "How are you going to make sure that we as elected officials stay updated on what's going on in your agency and the crime, but yet still have this buffer where our elected officials aren't trying to intercede in policing?" And I said, "You know what, Mr. Mayor?" I said, "Good policing is good politics." And he looked at me and he's like, "What?" I said, "As long as my agency does its job and I keep you informed as to what is happening, probably before it makes it to the media, they always like that, things will work out." And I tell you, that held true for me. I never had one of my elected officials ever come and try to intervene in a police related issue. They would only ask me for information. And that's kind of a rarity in today's world.
Yeah, unfortunately, you're right. It certainly is. It seems like the more they try to interject politics into it, we've gotten to where we are today. So that's been a dramatic change. Now, Tom, I think it's very improbable you led the career you had. You had a event that happened as a young officer that really could have derailed that. Talk us through that and how you came out the other end of that.
Yeah, so in August of 1987, I was shot in the line of duty, and I didn't really talk about it till after I retired, for several reasons I'll get into in a minute. But my shooting was this incident where it was 3 o'clock in the morning. We used single patrol vehicles in Riverside at that time. I was by myself. There was a car parked illegally. No big deal, something I deal with every day. I got out of the car to go up and get a VIN number off of it because it had no license plates on it. And the windows were darkened. And as I got out of my patrol vehicle, when I got to the front of my vehicle, the back door of that car literally rolled open and the offender rolled out like you'd see some military roll. And I heard the slide of the pump shotgun. You could never, that sound. And I was shot just like that. And I was shot with birdshot, so it spread. And the birdshot hit my bulletproof vest at that time. It sprayed into my eyes and mouth. So I survived that shooting. But what had happened, it lifted me off the ground and it threw me against my squad car, and I hit my head against the bumper and knocked me out. It also cut my police radio in half. So the portable radio that I had on me, the wire connecting the radio from my hip to the lapel mic was shredded. So I couldn't call for help when I woke up like about a minute later. And I believe they walked over me and probably thought I was dead because that was probably 10 feet between their car and where they shot me. And it was point blank, right in my chest, threw me up. And when I awoke, I had to crawl back to my squad car and use the police radio that was in the squad itself. And I had to call for help. And, I was amazed I was even able to do that. But so I was taken to the hospital. I was treated for broken ribs, internal bleeding, eye injuries, and some blood vessels had broken throughout my entire neck area and chest area. So I was in the hospital for about 3 days, and then I was released.
Wow. Not many people get to tell a story like that, point blank with a shotgun. Thank God that was birdshot and you had a vest on. But I had a friend get killed with birdshot, Chief, close range, but he was not wearing a vest. So I have to think that that probably dictated how you operated as a chief as you went through the ranks. Right? You had an experience there. You had the aftermath of that experience with the city and the agency. How did that help you navigate other critical incidents that would occur when you were in leadership positions?
Yeah, Riverside wasn't ready. It's the first police officer that ever had shot in the line of duty. They didn't really have good support. The officers were fantastic. The leadership just didn't know what to do, quite frankly. So me and my wife kind of had to navigate this situation. And as it happened, I was scheduled for vacation like 3 days after the shooting had taken place. So they allowed me to do that, to postpone it, but I had to go through all this medical testing and psychological testing to return to work. But they didn't send me to professionals that could handle police officers. I was being sent to a local hospital with a psychologist that had no experience at all. And then they put me under, and to help try to find the offenders, they wanted to put me under hypnosis. And I said, sure, that's fine. Well, they contracted with a doctor that had no skill at all in hypnosis and no, treating of police officers or first responders. He literally kind of tried to lead me down the road by saying stuff like, the car was green, right? I'm like, no, the car wasn't green. The car was green, right? I said, no, the car wasn't green. And it actually wrote me up as uncooperative. So I'll never forget that. And they just didn't know how to handle it. So I wanted to make sure if I ever got in a position of leadership that I would do everything to support my officers in these types of situations, in any situation. And it changed my philosophy, because there were a lot of people that told me, Tom, you should just stop working. I'm like, this is my skill. I went to college for it. I went to school for it. I've been a police officer. I'm newly married. I'm going to have a family. I just can't get up and quit. I mean, I just can't do that. And even though my wife wanted me to. And, a funny story about that bulletproof vest, the village of Riverside didn't provide vests back then. My wife purchased me that. She bought me that vest when I became a police officer as a gift. And back then it was a point blank. I don't know if you remember that. That was the name of the bulletproof vest. And a story behind that is I didn't like the way. So my chief came to me afterwards. He said, hey, Tom, Point Blank contacted us, and they're willing to buy a bulletproof vest for every single police officer free because of your shooting, if you agree to do commercials for them. I said, what do you mean by that? He's like, well, they want you to do print ads in police magazines, police chief magazines, other magazines, where you will tell your story, and they will in turn purchase vests. I'm like, yeah, I don't want to publicize this. This is something I'm proud of. And when he said, well, let them send you the script, they sent me this script, Travis. This is an absolute truth. And they embellished the story that didn't even happen. They made it seem like I was like in some type of gunfight. And this was 100% ambush.
Yeah.
And I told my chief then, and I only had 3 years on the job. I'm like, no, chief, I'm not going to do this. He's like, he got very angry at me and said, do you understand they will buy a bulletproof vest for every single officer if you just do this? I'm like, well, they're lying. They're embellishing this story for their benefit. I'm not going to go on any news program, or I'm not going in any print magazine. And I'm telling you, the chief held it against me for the rest of till he retired.
Well, yeah, because they're in a bad spot. They're going to have to buy these vests, and they wanted to get it for nothing, right?
Right, and they did end up buying them. You're correct.
Oh, man. You're talking about risk management 101. We wait till an officer gets shot before we provide vests. My goodness. Well, yeah, I mean, I tend to agree. I think many people, as you know, Chief, they leave the profession after an event like that. And you, of course, have gotten away through it, and you just recently started talking about it. There was a great article in Police One earlier this year, and I don't even know what to say to it. Obviously, it's a pretty incredible story, but I'm sure certainly it shaped your leadership style. But you became chief in a very unique time. How did you see? Just a minute. Mailman came. Let me give it a second. Hey. All right, here we go. Yeah, Chief, you became chief at a very unique time. Probably a time that we would all hearken back to. I'm trying to go back to 13 years before you retired, but things got really weird around 2012, 2013, 2014, and we really haven't looked back. Just give me your take on that and how you sort of navigated that, because the chief's job went from, we're going to focus on the mission, reducing crime. That tends to keep citizens happy of all political backgrounds, right? It certainly keeps politicians happy back in the day, to a time today where you can't even find a chief getting in trouble for higher crime. Like, the mission doesn't seem to be on the forefront. There seems to be all these external factors. And so maybe you were in a great situation there in Riverside, or maybe you weren't, but kind of how did you see that happening there locally, and then what you saw nationally?
Yeah, I was in a good position. So when, it's uncommon. Like when I was promoted up to chief, it's an appointment made by the city manager, the village manager, the elected officials. I had one requirement, that I wanted an employment contract, and they were like, no, we're not going to give you one. That's only for outside chiefs that come in, because if we don't like you in a year or two, you can just go back to your civil service rank of lieutenant. So we're not. I said, well, I'm not taking the job without that. So we negotiated I got a lawyer, they got their lawyer. We negotiated, and every 4 years the contract would be up. And there was a clause that they could fire me or reduce me for just cause, but I wanted some protection because I didn't want to be the type of chief that was, going to stay out of the fray just because my politicians didn't like it. And what I mean by that, it was rough times. There were times, Riverside is an upper middle class community, and most of our violent crime came from the city of Chicago. We were west of the city of Chicago. Our criminals would come west, they would commit violent crimes and flee back east. That was the absolute pattern that would happen all the time. And I was very open with the media, and I would put a lot of press releases out, or my detectives would put press releases out. We'd release mugshots. We'd be very, very proactive. And some of the residents and elected officials didn't like it because they thought it made the village look crime-ridden. Instead of giving the residents education about what's actually going on and not lying to them and giving them what's currently happened, I always was of the opinion, Travis, is how could you make proper safety decisions for you and your family if the police department's not putting out factual information? Yeah. Like, how do you do that? So, I had to maneuver through that. And luckily, I had a very good village manager that supported me, and a very good village president that supported me. But where I got a lot of the pushback was? It's from other police chiefs, who actually were in their position because they were politically appointed there. And I got to be honest with you, if their mayor or city president told them not to do something, they wouldn't do it, even though it was the right thing to do. And I would get more pushback from my colleagues sometimes than I would from, my residents or politicians. And I could never figure that out. Like, why are you my worst, critic?
No, you hit the nail on the head right there. I mean, when we talk about courageous leadership, it talks about, hey, you just need to do what's right. Doesn't matter what some mayor says or what some activist says, what is right. And I think they're in such self-protection mode, Chief. Me, myself, and I, in protecting what I have, we're seeing an abject failure around the country because you're right. They're more concerned about that than actually taking care of the citizens, which is extremely ironic.
Yeah, once when I attended the FBI National Academy in Quantico, I went to this leadership class for the 12 weeks I was there. Very well known in the FBI ranks. The instructor was a highly decorated helicopter pilot, Marine helicopter pilot, and saw numerous combat. His name was Tim Turner. We sat in this stadium, and I'm Weitzel, right? And I'm at the top. It was alphabetical. So, cops, none of us like to sit towards the beginning. You know how that is, right? They don't want to sit near the front of the class. But they put us there alphabetically. And one day he looked up at me and he said, "Mr. Weitzel, come on down here." And I put him all the way down, and he said, "How's it going?" And I said, "I'm coasting." And there's like 2 weeks left of the academy. I had all my papers in, and he said, "What did you just say?" And I said, "I'm coasting." He's like, and then he unleashed on me in front of the whole class, which is 200 of us, international students. And he said, "Don't you ever say coasting in front of me again." He's like, "Because you know what, Mr. Weitzel, if you're coasting, you're going downhill, and you want to be a leader." And he goes, "You don't ever want to go downhill, do you, Tom?" And I'm like, "Okay, no, I don't." And then he built me back up after that, and he set me back up. And he's like, he made this example of me. And then while I was walking up the stairs back to my seat, he said, "Hey, Tom, do you think leaders are born, or can we create leaders?" And I said, "I think you can educate leaders and you can build leaders." He goes, "I agree with you." He goes, "The one thing you can't do, Tom, is charisma." He goes, "Charisma you're born with." He goes, "Leaders, I believe we can develop." And that was like an introduction to me of leadership. I was like, well, it was really powerful.
Yeah. I wasn't too far behind you. I was in 227, so my math probably 2 or 3 years after you. And I don't have a story like that. I got stories I probably can't tell, but yeah, very, very interesting time for sure. And you're seeing, and Tom, even though you've been gone about 3 years from the profession, you've got to be shaking your head at what continues to happen. We go from recruiting issues and retention issues. Is it mainly what you just said about politics that's creating this, or is there something else going on we should discuss about it?
It is politics. There's no one that can be listening or watching your podcast and doesn't know that the George Floyd incident affected law enforcement, without a doubt, right? That was huge. All three of my adult children are police officers in suburban Chicago. I hear it all the time. Now, they all have at least 10 years on the job, and some of them want to leave the profession, or they want to leave the department out of the metropolitan Chicago area and get farther out away into really suburban policing. And it's all because of the way that politicians are interacting with law enforcement, the way media organizations, at least some of them, and the public and these so-called activists who want to just have a state of like depolicing and no policing at all, let alone defund policing. And in Illinois, if any, there was this recent article about, well, defund the police is gone. I wrote an op-ed in the paper that said it's not gone. What's happening is our politicians are defunding the police through legislation, and the job is almost impossible to do. It's really, Travis, at times impossible to defend yourself because no police officer wants to be the next YouTube video.
Yeah, it's really a dangerous time when officers are more concerned about YouTube than they are about going home at night, right? And we're seeing that time and time again. And what would be your advice to a chief or somebody out there with that type of authority at an agency that's maybe facing this external pressure? What kind of advice would you give them, Tom?
You have to stand up. You have to lead. You're a leader for a reason. Like when I was in my position, I had deputy chiefs, lieutenants. All right, they managed the department. They managed the day-to-day operations of the police department. My job was to lead and set policy. That's really what it was, and also to be out there. These chiefs that stay in their office all day, Travis, forget about that. Those days are over. If you're still one of those dinosaurs, I don't even know how you're surviving. You need to be out there. You need to communicate, and you need to have your facts too. I always liked to listen to chiefs or superintendents or executives who could make their case as to why something could happen, but they weren't just talking crap. They had facts behind it, they had experience behind it, and they knew what they were talking about. I think that carries a lot of weight.
Yeah, and you've got to be principle driven. You've got to have core beliefs that you won't come off of, because if you don't have that, you're going to just blow with the wind, right? You'll cave in to whatever's out there. And I think we understand the phenomenon of why these chiefs are acting that way, but they have got to understand they've been put in this place during this time for a reason. There's a huge responsibility, and leadership is the answer. You can overcome all of what we're talking about, whether it's recruiting, retention, low morale, people leaving the profession, with leadership. And I think the frustrating part, Chief, is they all know it in their head, but we're not seeing it practice. And so I think it comes down to principles. And if you were to talk about your principles, Chief, what kept you steady, what kept you strong, what would be the principles that you had that really maintain your leadership focus?
I'm a person that always wanted to be a police officer. I went to Catholic grade school, and I used to run to the windows when I heard a siren go by, and the nun would have to pull me back to my seat. So I always wanted that. And I had good mentors. So I was always involved in police circles. My uncle was a police and fire commissioner where I grew up. So I was in that, that field, so to speak. And what I wanted is just to be true to myself. And I always wanted to never forget where I came from as I grew up. I think a lot of chiefs, they forget what it's like. Even sometimes I used to tell my field training officers, they would get frustrated with new recruits. And I was like, hey, you were sitting in that side of the squad 8 years ago too. Okay. Like we need patience. We have, as training officers, you need to know that one of the best skills you can have is patience. But I always wanted to be true to myself and to the beliefs that I had, which were that policing is, in my opinion, the most honorable profession in America. And I truly believe that. It sounds corny, but I absolutely believe it, or I wouldn't have probably had my kids all go into this profession. My wife is an accountant, and when all three of my children were sworn in as police officers, I thought she was going to divorce me. So, but so my wife said to me, "Why can't one of them be an accountant?" Because that's not what they want to do. And I encourage them to go in this profession, and I mentored them, and I talk to them about it all the time and the rights and wrongs of what to do. There's no such thing as a perfect police officer, but what your North Star is, and that's the principle you have to keep. I'll tell you a funny story. My son, well, actually, probably a serious story. He, when what went down in Uvalde, Texas, with that school shooting, well, my son came to me, my youngest son, who's a police officer here in Illinois. He said, I saw that the officers waited 73 minutes and that their supervisors at times were telling them, don't advance, don't advance. And my son turned to me at the dinner table and said, Dad, if my supervisor in the community he worked told him, don't advance, wait, he goes, I disregard his direct order, and I'd go down there and engage them. And he goes, I might get shot, I might get killed, but he goes, I could live with myself. And he goes, I don't care what my supervisors did to me. If I heard children being slaughtered, and those were his words, I'm advancing. And I'm like, that's the kind of kid I wanted to raise.
Yeah, and that's the kind of leadership we need, that regardless of what anybody says or does, you have to do what's right. And yeah, Tom, I think there's so much in the success you've had, and I did want to talk to you. I think you alluded to it, but one of the things that bugs me a lot with a lot of these leaders today is they'll say things like, well, I have an open door policy, right? Well, I'm thinking to myself, well, who's coming to your door? So how did you deal with that? I have a feeling you were very involved throughout your department, and you would go to their doors. So talk to our audience about that.
Yeah, without a doubt. So my office was directly outside of the roll call room to begin with, and I would go out on the street. I would answer calls with my officers. I would meet them in the parking lot. I would call them to meet me in a public parking lot. We could talk. For them to come to me, patrol officers, detectives are kind of reluctant to do that. So you really should go to them. But I did that with routine because I had a sergeant that I tried to mentor myself after. You probably have worked in organizations where the officers, like when we did picks, so we could pick shifts by seniority. And sometimes I would take the worst shift just because that sergeant was on the shift, because I knew this sergeant knew what he was doing, was a leader. And, police officers will follow leaders. And I could have been on day shift, maybe, and had a better shift, but this born leader was on midnights, and I wanted to work for him. And I would pick those shifts because I wanted to be on his shift. And that's the type of leadership I wanted to portray when I was chief. And I wanted my officers to know that I'll come to you. I mean, we would hold roll call in public before it was even something to do. But I would always go out and see my officers daily. And I would come in. So I would work midnight shifts. I would come in and work for example, Christmas Eve. I would come in and work New Year's Eve, just so the officers knew I was there and I wasn't this chief that was sitting in some ivory tower and I'm better than you. And I did that with frequency.
Yeah, without even asking, you were there 13 years. That has to do a lot to do with it, with the trust you built with your officers. And people misunderstand trust because trust isn't automatic. You have to trust them before they'll even begin to trust you. And that's one of the easiest way to do it, is what you're talking about. Now, Chief, one of the things that has evolved greatly in the last decade is technology. And you face this yourself. What type of balance did you have? Because I think there's a danger in technology to where we can over rely on it and we get away from that interpersonal leadership that we all know is effective. Tell us about the balance that you used when it came to the technology your agency used and the interpersonal relationships that you needed.
Yeah, we all got lazy as chiefs and commanders, and we started to lead by email. And, officers hate that. There are some things you have to put out by that, but I tried to stay away from that. We were the size department where you could either, my deputy chief or my patrol commander or me could go to roll call. I would personally go, especially if there was an important new policy or a new procedure we were putting out. But, I would always ask them, I'm like, here's the pursuit policy we're going to put out. What do you think? Like, give me some feedback on this. And yes, our village attorney wrote it along with my input and stuff, but give us practicalities. So I like to do the one-on-one communication. I wasn't the chief that shied away from that. And if they had criticism, they were allowed to say it respectfully. I didn't limit them from doing that.
Right.
And I became, it's a little difficult sometimes to come within the department because those officers that you grew up with, so to speak, they all know what you did, what idiot things you did as patrolman or sergeant, right? Mm-hmm. And now you're sitting as a chief, and sometimes you have to dole out some discipline. And to me, that's a harder road to walk sometimes. And I had to terminate officers I worked with because their actions were just too egregious. Mine were not duty related. Unfortunately, policemen sometimes have some of their worst decisions made in their off-duty conduct. So, I wanted to be getting back to that open and transparent. Like that was like such a tagline, right? So I never used it. I just wanted to be the chief from within the department that'll listen to you, and I'll go out and I'll go to your roll call and I'll come to your meeting. And there's one thing, Travis, too, I always did, no matter how minor your injury was, because over my 13 years as chief, I had officers injured in the line of duty, from broken legs to broken wrists to serious car accidents. I always came in. I always went to the hospital. He could have a broken wrist, and I left my home at 2:00 in the morning and I drove to that hospital and made an appearance so that their family and my officers knew I was there. It didn't have to be life-threatening.
Yeah. Yeah, that was always my rule. And my commanders would always say, well, we're not going to call you unless it's life-threatening. I said, no, if they're going to the hospital, I want to know. Because you're right. It doesn't take long to get up, drive to the hospital, see them for 5 or 10 minutes and make sure that means a lot. And that's really, really important.
Yeah, without a doubt. And I think officers build trust, and they tell all their officers, and it does show you care, So, I was I was out of state in Michigan, and one of my officers was involved in a shooting where he shot the offender, didn't kill the offender at that time. I was at a wedding reception in Michigan with my wife. I put my wife in the car. We left that wedding reception, drove all the way back to Riverside, probably about a 6-hour drive, and I went to the scene, and then I went from there to where they took the officer for the shooting to the hospital, because that's just what you do. If you're not a chief doing that, then you shouldn't have that position.
Tom, I wish I could bottle this up, man. We're going to have you back on, Chief Tom Weitzel. I can't thank you enough for being here. Please keep speaking out because your knowledge is powerful and many, many people need it. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I've thoroughly enjoyed it.
If you've been watching or you've been listening, thank you for doing that. And just remember, lead on and stay courageous.